Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I hope you had a restful and enjoyable BC Day weekend. Welcome to the show. Up first, do people who use wheelchairs have trouble finding and accessing taxi service? Coquitlam's mayor says one resident had to wait hours for a wheelchair-accessible taxi. What's your experience and what needs to change? After 12:30, food waste is a big problem in our world, and more people are trying to change their own habits. What are your tips for cutting back on food waste? I'm Michelle Eliot. This is BC Today. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Well, the mayor of Coquitlam is taking to social media to call out a local taxi company. In the post, Mayor Richard Stewart says he received a call from a resident whom he has known for years. And he says they were left stranded last night because they could not get a wheelchair-accessible taxi. The mayor called out one company in particular, Bel Air Taxi in Coquitlam. Now, for more on this story, we have reached CBC reporter Joel Ballard, who's covering this today. Hi there, Joel.
Hi, Michelle.
Now, you have just spoken to the mayor, Richard Stewart, today. What else has he said about this situation?
Yeah, so what Mayor Stewart told us is it was a resident of Coquitlam, a senior in a wheelchair, and basically he was stuck waiting for hours because he wasn't able to get a wheelchair-accessible vehicle. The mayor told us he ended up having to call the taxi company, Bel Air Taxi, who told him they have no wheelchair vehicles out on the roads right now. Mayor Stewart was also quite frustrated because he said this is an issue he has dealt with ever since he's been in power, and he's been in office for a while now. And he says he continuously runs into this issue where residents with disabilities are forced to wait long times or not even be able to access a taxi, and it really leads to a huge inequitability within the city.
Now, you are on this story today. You actually are in front of the company, Bel Air Taxi in Coquitlam right now, and you spoke to the company. Who did you speak to and what did they have to say?
Yeah, I spoke with the manager, Inder Nunn, and he told us that, this was an unfortunate situation. He, of course, apologized, but he said what really happened is, this isn't an issue in not having enough wheelchair-accessible vehicles. We have those. The problem here was the fact that we're already dealing with a shortage of taxi drivers right across the industry, linking that to the growth of Uber and Lyft and ride-hailing companies like that, many drivers leaving the taxi industry to go to those industries. He also mentioned it was a long weekend, so already they were short the staff they normally have. And then on top of that, he said not all of our drivers are trained on operating the wheelchair vehicles. He says they do special training with their drivers, and really in this situation, they just had a shortage of drivers who could drive that vehicle.
Okay, Joel, we look forward to more of your coverage today. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. Bye.
Bye-bye. CBC's Joel Ballard from Coquitlam. 9 minutes now past 12 o'clock, past 1 o'clock in the Mountain Time Zone, and we're going to take your calls on this. Advocates say finding accessible transportation, including taxi services throughout BC, has been an issue for years. And we're asking you, what is your own experience with getting a wheelchair-accessible taxi? And what do you think needs to change? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, star or pound 690. You can send an email too. It's bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining us to take your calls is Heather McCain. They're the founder and executive director of Live, Educate, Transform Society. Good afternoon, Heather. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You just heard the response and the reasons for the delay from Bel Air Taxi. What do you make of their explanation?
Well, I think there's lots of excuses that have been used over the years as to why there aren't accessible taxis on the road or available for those who need them. But there aren't enough consequences for when this happens. And I can understand them being short drivers. but they know that an accessible taxi is a requirement, and therefore they should make it a priority to train other drivers to use the accessible taxis.
What do you find surprising or perhaps not surprising about this story?
I don't find the story surprising at all. Actually, Mayor Stewart, there was a 2018, he also had a story about this, about someone who was stranded for 3 hours after a Canada Day event. And I know that just this past weekend, it was Vancouver Pride, and we had issues with trying to get transportation there. So
Hmm.
accessible transportation is an issue that we started our organization because of, and that was in 2005, and it continues to be an issue now.
And as you mentioned, and as the mayor mentioned to Joel Ballard as well, this has been an issue he's seen. And it sounds like in this case, he received a phone call from a resident. What do you make of the fact that a mayor is getting involved? What do you think is the role then for the city when it comes to this?
I think it's great that the mayor is getting involved, but I think that we have to be thinking about the people who don't necessarily have the connections to make that call to the mayor,
Hmm.
who are also being stuck in this situation, who don't feel like there's anyone that they can reach out to or get attention for, or for all the people who get stranded and there is no news story, because that happens quite regularly. I think that the government needs to work both, municipality and provincially, to start putting some teeth into the consequences of when these situations happen, because currently the news story is told, this people are outraged and then nothing happens.
Mm. And you just said there need to be consequences. The mayor's social media post ends with the statement, "There will be ramifications in the morning." What do you think those consequences or ramifications should be?
In the case of Coquitlam, I think maybe the taxi company should have to come before council and explain what's going on, as well as make a commitment that is then checked up on as to how they are going to address this issue.
Speaking with Heather McCain and asking you what your experience has been in accessing wheelchair accessible taxis and what do you think needs to change. Heather McCain, they're the founder and executive director of the Live Educate Transform Society. Would love to hear from you as well about your experience and what you think needs to change. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, star or pound 690. And on that government responsibility, we have a call from Dennis in Victoria who'd like to make a comment. Hi, Dennis. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how you doing?
I am fine. Thanks so much for calling. What are your thoughts on this story?
Well, I just found it curious that the government is calling a taxi company to come and account for why there is no provision of a basic human right. This is the province of the government. The mayor should be talking to the province to look at what they can do to provide transportation for differently abled people. I mean, what if the taxi company only has one vehicle? Should they invest in more vehicles to make this basic right available to everyone? It's a private company. The government should be responsible for making sure there's transportation for differently abled people.
And what part of that responsibility by the government, whether it's the province or the municipality, has to do with enforcing those requirements, Dennis?
Well, I'm not familiar with the bylaw that says taxi
Sure.
companies has to have these vehicles available.
Okay.
I'm just commenting from the standpoint of a citizen. I mean, if I can't get from point A to point B because I'm disabled, and the mayor is looking to a private company whose investment is dependent on a person's personal income, that's not an adequate solution to a very important problem.
Okay, so rather than
I'm
calling
thinking
out,
they should be looking at handy darts that are provided for by the province or that sort of thing. Otherwise, we'll never solve this. I mean, like
Yeah.
I'm a small business owner myself, and I can tell you, we have a real hard time getting drivers to drive our vehicles. And when we try to access the foreign worker program,
yeah.
we jump through hurdles upon hurdles to get people here. So,
Okay, so that's interesting, Dennis. And what is it? What is your company?
Well, I mean, I'm in construction, but right now I'm operating at 30% of capacity because I don't have drivers.
Right.
So I really feel for this taxi company. It's
Okay.
not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, so you're relating to that issue around staffing shortage, then, which we know affects so many sectors, right? Dennis, thank you so much for the call. Really interesting points there. Let's go back to Heather McCain on that. Rather than calling out an individual taxi company, and he says these companies, all companies he's in construction, are struggling with that staffing issue. What about addressing it in a more systemic way?
For sure, this is not a problem of just one taxi company. This is, across Metro Vancouver and possibly the province. And so it is something that needs to be looked at in that systemic way. And unfortunately, the alternatives to the taxi company, such as HandyDart, are inaccessible to a lot of people. And for example, they have 3 very large steps at the front of the bus. So people who have agility issues, balance, who can't get up those steps, are unable to use it. There is a ramp at the back, but it floats into the air 5 feet. So a lot of people are not comfortable standing on that. And HandyDart has very limited hours. So for people who work, for people who, want to get involved with events, it doesn't work with their schedule. And so I think the main thing I would just say is that, it's not the disability that's stopping people from accessing the transportation.
Right.
It's the fact that the transportation itself is not accessible, or declares that it is, but then has these kind of gatekeeping strategies that keep that access from being actually experienced.
And HandyDart is operated by TransLink, is that right?
It's a subsidiary of
A
TransLink. Yes.
subsidiary. So would it be then, have there been calls for HandyDart to make their vehicles more accessible and expand those hours as well?
Yes, there certainly have. And I know that there's a couple groups working right now to try and push towards that. HandyDart was originally created to help disabled people have personal lives, get out in the community, and a lot of the rides are now used mostly for medical needs, which the government used to provide and then shifted it over to HandyDart. So, it's what it originally started as changed, and unfortunately it's not accessible to everybody, and the booking itself can be very problematic. So yeah, we have members who have been given free tickets to go to concerts or hockey games, who then have to leave halfway through because HandyDart doesn't actually continue running until the end of the game or the concert. And so these are the frustrations that disabled people live with on a regular basis.
Well, let's hear from someone now who works in long-term care. Our numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And we are talking about a story out of Coquitlam in which the mayor of Coquitlam is calling out a local taxi company after he says he got a phone call from a local resident who had to wait hours for a wheelchair accessible taxi. We're asking for your experience and what you think needs to change. Donna is on the line now from the News Bay. Hi, Donna. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you.
What are your thoughts on this story? What's your experience?
Well, I work in long-term care, and we often have to book wheelchair taxis for residents that are going out for tests, or, if they happen to be lucky enough to be going out to spend some time with their family. And it's weeks in advance we have to book. And, excuse me, and we even end up having to cancel appointments because the taxi may be late, tied up in traffic. They can't send just another car because it, doesn't have the wheelchair taxi available. And the mayor, I'm not in Coquitlam, but just as you said that, the mayor calling out the taxi company, he's the mayor. He should be the one fixing it, not calling out the taxi company because, they can't hire enough people to sustain what needs to be done. Our population is aging, and as they age, their mobility decreases, and we need to get on board with reality here and catch up with times.
What impact does that have on your residents? I mean, what happens when you have to book weeks in advance? Sometimes they have to cancel. What impact does that have on people you work with?
Well, that's depressing for them. Then the appointment that they had has to be rescheduled. That appointments, we all know how hard it is to get in to see an eye or an X-ray
Sure.
or maybe a scan or something. That so now it's weeks and weeks down the road. Maybe it's a special treatment that they need to go to. We live in a small community in this area. Maybe they need to go into the city, Nanaimo, for this. And now what? Now so what do you have to do? Do you have to send them by ambulance then for something that really shouldn't be taking up that time of an ambulance?
Yeah, that goes to that resource as well, doesn't it?
Exactly.
We know there are long waits for ambulances as well. Donna, really good to hear from you in the news space. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Let's go back to Heather McCain. What did you think of her point? And as well, I'd love to hear from you on what this means for equity when it comes to whether people that Donna work with, people you work with your organization too.
Yeah, I mean, what Donna said definitely resonated with me. I think the fact that there isn't that reliability severely impacts disabled people's ability to go about their daily life, when you're not able to know for sure that the taxi will show up. It also creates a lot of anxiety for people because, if it is, say, like a treat to go out in the community, they'll be looking forward to that, but there'll also be this anxiety that they're holding on to, trying to prepare themselves in case of disappointment. And that's something that's very hard to live with, or to try to kind of continue to have hope over when it's been canceled again and again. And when it's for a medical appointment, I mean, this really speaks to the inequity of our healthcare system, the fact that there is no accessible transportation available through the hospitals to get patients to the appointments that they need to get to. And as Donna said, that may require them to rebook, and who knows how long that rebooking takes and what effect that will have on their health.
We have another caller now from Prince George, and Kelly is on the line. Hi, Kelly. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. What's your experience?
We own a small taxi company in the interior of BC, and I'd like to just point out a few things, and then I'll step offline. One, there's a misconception. A lot of the public believe that the taxi industry is subsidized by the government. That is 100% false. We are not. There's absolutely no subsidies from the government for the taxi owner. For a small taxi company to go and get a wheelchair-accessible van, we're looking at anywhere roughly around $100,000, give or take, and there's absolutely no help from the government to help with this. Three, I had a call this weekend from the hospital to take a person in a wheelchair. I couldn't accommodate them, and Handy Dart had already closed. Handy Dart their hours are not long enough. They don't work. A lot of the interior towns, Handy Dart doesn't work weekends. Handy Dart should be 24/7, just like our paramedics are, because it is an essential service.
That's something we just heard from Heather McCain on that, isn't it? And Kelly,
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, you just talked about the cost of acquiring an accessible taxi. What about the staffing issue that we've heard about? Have you had trouble finding drivers? Have you been affected by Uber or other ride-hailing services, for example?
Yes. Drivers are getting hard to come by, but dealing with the PTB is extremely difficult for any taxi company owner. Like for me to
Passenger
change my
Transportation
rate,
Board. Okay.
yeah, for me to change my rates, I have to go through a very strenuous process, and it could take anywhere from 1 to 6 months to get the approval. And by the time the approval comes in, it's too late. Like a lot of the drivers that you want to hire, like they're already gone. If you want to give them a better rate.
Okay. And so when you say, there should be government subsidies, we've been hearing about what is the role for the province on this? And that's what you think there should be subsidies for taxi companies to have more cabs available.
Yes,
Okay.
the taxi industry should be designated as an essential service to the public because we are, and there should be more help to the taxi company owners because it's a dog eat dog world. It's not an easy industry to make money on, and for the government to expect us to dish out that $100,000 for an accessible vehicle is
Okay.
it's virtually impossible to do for a lot of them.
Kelly, thank you very much for the call. And a statement from the Ministry of Transportation says, referring to this situation cited by Mayor Stewart in Coquitlam, says this was an unfortunate situation and the ministry understands how frustrating it must be when the specialized transportation a person needs isn't available. People deserve to have reliable options to get where they need to go. The ministry has consulted with the provincial accessibility community and with the taxi industry, including wheelchair accessible vehicle owner-operators who have expressed their concerns regarding wait times. To help address this issue, the ministry launched the Passenger Transportation Accessibility Program to increase the number of accessible taxis on the road and reduce wait times for people with accessibility requirements. Let's take one last call here before we go back to our guest. Mohammed is joining us from Souk. Welcome, Mohammed. Thanks for calling.
Hi, thank you. So my issue is with a number of these people who keep saying that government should be providing more. Handy Dart was brought in as a service to provide services during a regular business day. It's not meant to operate 24 hours a day. It's not even meant to operate 18 hours a day.
Oh, really?
It would not be cost effective for them to do that because they're going to have such few calls and the cost to operate during those hours is ridiculous. The other issue is government has put into place regulations. Large taxi companies need to have wheelchair accessible vehicles. The same way that buildings, when they're built, need to provide wheelchair accessibility. So don't expect government to do everything. We're going to go bankrupt if the government has to provide every service. So I find it ridiculous that these people are expecting government to spend more and more money for diminishing return. In fact, not just diminishing, negative returns.
But it's
so
about
the regulations are there.
Taxi companies need to abide by regulations, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I don't expect the little tiny taxi companies to do that, but certainly the large companies that have a fleet, they need to provide that service, and they are required to provide that service by law.
Mohammed, thank you very much for the call. That's Mohammed joining us from Souk. Let's go back then to Heather McCain, the founder and executive director of the Live, Educate, Transform Society. Hearing about where the responsibility lies there. As I understand it, BC has a taxi bill of rights that's supposed to cover the rights of both passengers and taxi drivers in this province. What actually needs to happen then to ensure that passengers with disabilities have access to the service they need?
Well, something that disabled people experience quite a lot is that we have things in writing that don't actually get lived up to. And so that is a huge issue. There are regulations, there are rules, there's a Bill of Rights, but whether that is actually, actually delivered to the passenger is a whole other story. And whether there is any kind of external oversight to check that this is happening. So, the government creating more committees or creating more regulations doesn't actually help if they're not already making sure that the current regulations and the current, kind of the past committees' suggestions are actually being utilized. And this is something that is experienced, throughout the conversations about disability and civil rights of, we can wallpaper Victoria with the amount of things that have been written to try and help disabled people. But if they're not actually, if there's no consequences for when people don't live up to that, and that includes, the BC Accessibility Act, it doesn't have the teeth that the disabled community needs it to have.
Is there actually, I note that this resident called up the mayor, as you said, not everybody has that kind of connection or access. Is there a complaints process?
The complaints process is usually to phone the independent, the contractor itself, so the taxi agency. And unfortunately, our members typically either never hear back or they get hung up on as they're trying to make the complaint. Some have then tried to go to City Hall, but not really gotten anywhere because there is no kind of one specific person to talk to. So that is really frustrating, and there is no kind of way to direct people unless they contact organizations such as mine, and we kind of go through the process with them. But you shouldn't need, an organization or to know a certain individual in order to get a response, because that's the thing, is that there are definitely times where the taxi company, it is an honest mistake, or the van broke down, or there were issues with, the driver who was supposed to be driving it. But if they don't communicate that to people with disabilities, then that's, it makes it a harder conversation to have the next time.
Okay. And what was the independent party again that's in charge of complaints? Because that may be something we can follow up on as well.
Oh, I meant the independent, like the contractor itself.
Oh, I see,
so
the contractor itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Heather, really good to have you with us and give that perspective and context to this story. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Heather McCain is the founder and executive director of the Live, Educate, Transform Society. It's 12:31 now, 1:31 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming as well on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Welcome to you watching us there. I'm Michelle Eliot. And coming up in our next half hour, we're going to ask you, how do you cut back on food waste? What are your tips for using up those food scraps and leftovers so they don't just end up in the compost bin? We'll have that conversation with two guests coming up after this CBC News Update with Michelle Morton.
Good afternoon. Here are the headlines from the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Almost 36 new wildfires have sparked since yesterday, most of which were caused by thunderstorms. Rain and cooler temperatures could bring some relief to BC wildfire crews in the coming days, but relief is expected to be short-lived. The warm and dry weather trend is expected to return towards the end of the week. A BC Supreme Court judge has ruled doctors can remove a 65-year-old man from life support almost 3 months after he suffered a heart attack. The case ended up in court when the man's daughter sought an injunction to continue his treatment at St. Paul's Hospital. He went into cardiac arrest that left him without a pulse for 45 minutes, resulting in a lack of oxygen to the brain. The doctors agree it would be in the patient's best interest to discontinue with life support, and continued care would likely lead to a persistent vegetative state with no conscious awareness. In his ruling, the judge says it would be inappropriate for the court to interfere with the clinical judgment of the physicians. And the Abbotsford Police Board has announced a replacement for Chief Constable Mike Sear, who plans to retire from the Abbey PD in November. Colin Watson will take over as the new chief. He's been with Victoria Police for 26 years and is currently a deputy chief with the Vic PD. In the local forecast, mostly cloudy today, highs of 23, and for tonight, periods of rain, cooling down to 16, and tomorrow, cloudy skies, highs of 22, and a low of 15 in the evening. Now back to BC Today with Michelle Eliot.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We're talking food waste in this segment coming up. Do you struggle with leftovers, or do you have a system?
I feel like I have two hollow legs, Michelle. I feel like food waste is never a problem with me.
No leftovers whatsoever. That's great. No, I usually am able to stretch things for a couple of days.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, that's good. But I try not to. I also have a family who I believe also have hollow legs. So,
well, too, I have I like to use the glass Tupperware containers if I do make too much and the hollow legs eventually fill up. Those always help, but I usually try not to. I don't know. Or maybe it's just because I just love food so much, Michelle.
Yeah,
I know. It's so fun to eat.
That's really the most preferred way, wouldn't it be? To just eat everything inside. I made chickpeas with butter chicken sauce last week just for an easy dinner, and I had it for lunch for like 2 days.
Yes.
It was so good.
And I bet the flavors just were extra rich because they were marinating longer.
That's
I'll have to get that recipe for you, please.
There you go. It's as easy as opening up a jar. I'm not creative. A jar and a can.
Pouring cereal can be a lot for me, so that's just what I'm saying.
There you go. Chefs, we are not. Michelle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michelle Morton in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1, and we're live streaming too on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Very nice to have you with us. And yes, if you open up your fridge and pull out perhaps a crisper drawer, do you see some unused celery in the back that's going bad, or wilted broccoli? And are they bound to end up in the compost bin? Well, food waste is a growing problem, and the UN says it accounts for 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, this half hour, we're talking about getting in the habit of throwing away less food. And this is a topic on the CBC podcast, 10 Minutes to Save the Planet. And here is a clip now. You can find the episode No More Rotting Tomatoes on their podcast page. And this is a clip about how to change our behavior, starting with how we organize our fridge. Jiaying Zhao, or Jay-Z, is a professor of psychology and sustainability at the University of BC.
The fridge is not designed with human behavior in mind. Why? Because we're asked or advised to put perishables in the drawers or to the back of the fridge when it's the coolest. So what we should do instead is completely kind of feng shui our fridge. So what I have been doing with my own fridge is I put perishables at the door. I move everything that will go bad. Soon I move them to the door. So when I open the fridge, I see them right away and I use them. And I put the condiments, the durables in the drawers and in the back because they last and they can just stay there forever. Put mustard in the back, ketchup in the back, put the fruits, vegetables at the door. And I have not wasted a single piece of carrot since I've done that.
I love that. We're asking you, what are your own tips for cutting back on food waste? And how do you use up leftovers and even food scraps? Love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, star or pound 690. And we have two guests joining me here in our studio to talk about the issue and impact of food waste. Tamara Soma is a professor of food systems at Simon Fraser University. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Thanks for inviting me.
Very nice to have you with us. And to talk about ideas for what you can do in your own kitchen, Shanti Yen is executive chef at Nightshade Restaurant. And hello to you, Chef. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so nice to have you both. This is an issue that I deal with in my home. I look at that compost bag and I go, why is it overflowing again? Professor Soma, to you first. Just give us the big picture of how big a problem food waste is, especially household food waste.
Household food waste is a major problem. Food waste is a major problem globally, but in Canada, 58% of food that's produced for human consumption is wasted. And this is about $49 billion worth in terms of the economic cost, not the true cost, which, it starts getting higher when you start factoring in the water, the energy, labor. And in terms of what the National Zero Waste Council said, 63% of food that is wasted by Canadians are actually preventable, which means that they're avoidable food waste.
Okay, they're not the unusable parts
right.
of produce and things like that. And what about, people may think, but I compost, doesn't that help?
I think the thing with composting is that it is a more sustainable waste management approach. However, avoiding food from going into the compost, if you can, is number one. So prevention should always be number one. Reduction is next. And then after that, better management of food waste.
Okay, and we're going to hear ways that we can do that as well. Chef Yan, you said to me, every home cook needs to get a little scrappy and create and turning leftovers into gold. I love that, right? Leftovers is not just something that you kind of grumble about eating. It's turning it into gold. What can we do to make really good use of those food scraps?
Look, everything's so expensive and waste is going to happen. So we have to find a way to stretch our dollar, maximize the potential of the food that's in your fridge already. And, get creative, get scrappy, add some personality into your plate. Some ways that I can think of is that if your shopping list or your eyes are bigger than your consumption, which happens to everyone, right?
Sure.
A good way to do that is to store what you are going to be using for later, reorganizing your refrigerator, or even using some traditional practices like canning to your jams and jellies and some things that you can kind of capture the essence of the season and use for later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the farmer's market and got some blueberries. And of course, you can get, boxes.
Absolutely.
I'm a big fan of freezing them up for later on in the season for sure.
Absolutely. Another thing that I find is very useful is to grow foods that you like to eat. Offset your purchasing by growing things like herbs or something that's really easy to maintain and to manage, because that could save you hundreds throughout the year and also reduce your plastic usage.
Yes, for sure. And you don't need a lot of space to grow herbs.
Not at all. Space is hard to find around here. So if you have a little space in your windowsill, why not grow something that you like to eat?
Yeah, absolutely. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. Those are our phone numbers. And you can use your cell phone too. It's star or pound 690. We'd love to hear your own ideas for cutting back on food waste. Is that something you've been focusing on? It's something I have been trying to do for sure in my household. And if you have any recipes or tips for, using up your leftovers, maybe giving it new life, and those food scraps too. Give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. And my guests are Tamara Soma, Professor of Food Systems at Simon Fraser University, and Shanti Yen is Executive Chef at Nightshade Restaurant. And Peter sent us an email. My favorite second uses of food are saving vegetable scraps like onion ends and carrot peels and meat bones in the freezer in a bucket when full, making stock, and when the bucket is full, making stock and using that for rice. Oh, yes. And homemade bread in the bread maker machine. Also saving bacon fat for the oil portion of the bread, or other times cooking oil is needed. Oh, fantastic ideas.
Very good idea.
Yes. Okay. So onion ends. Yes, that's a lot of people do that, right? For soup stock, for example, and carrot peels. Okay, I'm making carrots tonight, so that's a good tip for me. What other ways can people reuse? Yes, those kind of parts that they may just be inclined to put in the compost.
So making stocks is a really good way of using all of that up, or turning, or not even peeling your carrots at all. There's lots of fibers at the ends of your broccoli stems, your carrots, and the onion scraps could easily go into a flavor booster. So maybe freezing some of your stocks as well to use later on.
Yeah, wonderful. And you maybe don't have to buy then like separate scallions or things like that, because that may serve the purpose, wouldn't it?
Yes.
What about for you, Professor Soma? Do you have any ways that you do that you apply, what you teach in your own home?
Absolutely. Actually, I am an educator, so I do have a class where I teach students. And I know that with students, for example, they might be learning about cooking. So there's a website called lovefoodhatewaste.ca. And so if you look in your fridge and you're like, oh, there's a celery here, I'm not sure what to do with it, you can actually put that on the search, and then they will come up with a bunch of different recipes for you, bread crust, or milk or whatever.
Yes.
So lovefoodhatewaste.ca is a pretty nifty website.
That's great. And we have a call coming in now. Lovefoodhatewaste.ca is where you can go. You can search up an ingredient, a bit of leftover ingredient, and find a recipe there. We're going to get some ideas too for recipes from our guests in just a moment. But let's take a call right now. Sylvia is on the line from Kelowna, asking you, what are your ideas and tips for cutting back on food waste? Hi, Sylvia.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for all of the wonderful shows and ideas on food waste.
Yes.
I just wanted to share, I'm a CPA, so the money aspect always comes into everything for me.
Sure.
And I just wanted to talk about, before we buy anything to put in our fridge and cupboards, it's amazing how much you can save if you're intentional about it.
What a great
and you do
point.
Some meal planning. And
absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah. What have you learned?
Yeah. Well, I've learned that meal planning can save not only time, but it can also save a ton of money. I found once I started meal planning a week ahead or a week in advance, or even the work week ahead, I found that we were wasting way less. So that was the first part of my journey. And then on top of that, of course, learning what to do if I did have any leftovers. But I just wanted to mention the cost of waste too. It has such a huge impact. So
Absolutely.
If we're intentional about it before we buy it, I think that makes a big difference.
That is a really, really good point, Sylvia. And can you tell us, give us a figure? What difference has it actually made to your bill?
Well, it's a little bit hard now because the prices are so expensive.
Right.
Right.
I see what you're saying.
Our family size has changed, so we're empty nesters now. But when we had our daughter at home, we noticed that I would say a couple $100 if we were really careful.
Well, okay, that's a really pertinent point that you make about meal planning and the financial aspect of this as well. I'm so glad you called, Sylvia. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. That's Sylvia joining us from Kelowna. Yes, Tamara and Shanti, what do you make of that? You talked about your eyes are bigger than your stomach when you're shopping, but actually planning things out at the start of the week.
I think assessing it and shopping with intention is a really good point, because you could really stretch your dollar by buying whole foods. Like if you are going to buy a chicken, that could be turned into multiple meals. And, there's a lot of pressure and anxiety in trying to figure out what you want for your family. Someone wants something different, or you want to diversify your meal throughout the week. So going with an intention and with a plan is always very important. It could save you hours and hundreds of dollars.
What are the ingredients that you can stretch the most, that you can reuse the most? Is there something that comes to mind? You just said chicken, for example, but
Everything that's seasonal, you could definitely stretch. For
Okay,
example,
seasonal.
going back to the first conversation was with carrots. For carrot scraps, you can turn that into different derivatives like breads, muffins, cakes, loaves, or even a carrot puree. You can stretch almost everything that you purchase, and you could freeze it. We have technology that you can save these things for later. But yeah, you can repurpose almost everything if you really put your mind to it.
repurposing it for muffins, that is so fantastic. I know when we have chicken, often we'll use the leftovers, if it's roast chicken, we'll use it to make fried rice, chicken fried rice the next day. It's and it's
Absolutely.
something that my kids look forward to.
Of course, of course.
And what about you, Tamara? What did you make from that? The food insecurity, of course.
Yeah, well, she made a very important point, especially when it comes to the calculation is that on average, pre-inflation, a household in BC would basically throw out about $1,200 worth of food per year. So it's almost like going to the grocery store, leaving the grocery store with 4 bags, and then just leaving the one like in a parking lot or something.
Yeah.
So I think that is very important with meal planning, but also like with portion control. So that's actually really good. And we do meal planning and portion control at home. So then we don't have like a lot of extra leftovers and we don't eat too much and don't waste the rest.
Yeah, but not buying more than you need at the outset. Really great tip there. Let's take some more of your calls asking you for your own tips on cutting back on food waste and what are the ways that you are able to repurpose those food scraps and those leftovers. Our number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And our next caller is Janet from Vancouver. Hi, Janet. Thanks for calling.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I just wanted to call in and suggest that if people are finding that they have a surplus of food in their kitchen, to look out for community pantries and community fridges in their neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And I just actually found one last night in my neighborhood. I had a few extra items that I didn't want to go to waste, so I was able to bike over, and that's in the Kitsilano neighborhood. There's also one in the Mount Pleasant area. It's just a short or quick web search away. So if you do find that there's more, you have more to consume that you're not going to use in your own household, then passing along these items to community fridges and community pantries is a great way to sort of prevent the food waste.
It's so needed right now because so many people, we're talking about food waste issues, but so many people lack access to food, especially nutritious food. And you just found this community kitchen, Janet. Were there any rules? What were the requirements for the kind of food you'd be able to drop off?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it wasn't a community kitchen. It's a community pantry. So basically...
Pardon me. Okay, so it's non-perishable items.
Oh, it's non-perishable and perishable. There's a fridge. So basically outside on the sidewalk is sitting like a cabinet and a fridge and a freezer. So you can bring in, it's open 24 hours a day. So you can come by and drop off your perishable as well as your frozen foods and your pantry items.
Okay, great stuff. And then you plan to do it again, I imagine?
Yeah, I'll definitely do it again if I find myself having extra stuff. So you can bring extras from your garden. You can bring canned items. You could bring any sort of frozen type foods that you might have that you're not using, pre-made meals and that type of thing. And somebody was there ready to pick up some stuff actually when I was dropping off. So it seems used.
Yeah, well, I bet it is. I wouldn't be surprised if it was very well used. Janet, thank you so much. It's a really good tip, and I do want to explore that more with my guests here. I asked a lot of specific questions because I've been through that, wondering where I could drop off food, and I wasn't sure if it was acceptable, and so I ended up sharing it among extended family. I had some extra bananas. But how do these kinds of community kitchens work, and do they ever worry about, taking perhaps cooked food or perishable items?
In my experience, I find that when I'm catering a wedding or if I'm catering a private party, there's generally lots of food left over.
Sure.
So I just go on and search for the closest commissary kitchen or the closest community that I can drop this food off. And there's generally no problems whatsoever. And community is so important, right? So when it comes to repurposing some of your food, or if you have leftover, why not share it with some of your neighbors?
Yeah.
COVID was a really tough time, and we need to socialize a little bit more sometimes as well. So it's such a good way to sharing is caring.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a way to show caring for your community. And,
Yeah.
and what about you, Professor?
So at Simon Fraser University, there's actually a community fridge that can be used by staff and faculty and students. And so we share, at the community fridge. It's located at the Student Union building. So that's really handy. But I also know that there's a lot of apps and community organizations that's doing a lot of work, redistributing perfectly edible good food.
Okay, yeah, so that's certainly something, that addresses the issue of food waste along with food insecurity that we are most certainly dealing with right now. Let's take another caller here. Gwen is on the line from 100 Mile House to talk about reducing food waste. Hello there, Gwen. Thanks for calling.
Well, you're welcome. As an impulse, I'm as I told your interviewer, I'm 80 years old. I've been cooking for a long time. It's an interest of mine, and what I do every once in a while is I just don't go shopping for a week. So
oh, really?
And then I have to look in the crisper and the freezer and the fridge and it forces me to be creative and use up some of the stuff that needs to be eaten, and I find it's really helpful.
What a great challenge for yourself.
It works.
Can you tell me about something that you've come up with then? You're opening up the fridge and I'm not going to buy anything new, just work with what I have here. It's almost like a competition show. Gwen, what have you come up with?
Well, the other day I had some cucumber, and ordinarily I just make a cucumber salad, but this time I put some frozen peas in it. I thawed them a little bit first with hot water, and I had a little bit of a dip that I'd made with dill and mayonnaise and yogurt. And so I put that on it. There's a nice creamy dressing, and it made it a lovely little salad.
Oh my goodness, that sounds delicious.
It was actually, and used up, a couple of things that needed eating, and was a bit different.
And have you ever not come up with something?
Well, I eat pretty well.
Yeah. Everything gets used. Gwen, I love that as a challenge for yourself. Not going to go shopping this week. I'm going to work with what I have. It forces you to be creative, and you came up with this lovely salad. I love it. Thank you so much, Gwen.
Oh, you're welcome.
What a wonderful experiment.
Absolutely.
That's so great. Have you done that for yourself as a chef?
I have. Like when you open your fridge up and you get past that guilt of like, oh, I've left that in the fridge for way too long. It's past its prime. And that's when you have to take action and get creative. Turn your leftover rice into homemade breads. Turn your leftover vegetables into dumplings. There's so many things and so many ideas that you can come up with.
Well, here's a good question, though, for those leftovers, because I know we have the debate over best before dates and when to actually abide by those. Brian asks, I would like to know if leftovers create bad bacteria. So food safety-wise, what should we keep in mind?
Food safety is definitely an issue that everyone should be aware of, especially when it comes to temperature. And I think Chef will know a lot about what when it comes to food safety. But one thing about the best before date is that the best before date is not necessarily accurate. Usually you need to focus on the use by date, and there's a difference between expiry date and best before date.
Right.
So there's actually a lot more flexibility when it comes to best before date, and expiry is what you need to worry about, and that's usually with meal replacement or baby formula. That's where you need to be very, very careful. But when it comes to, I've seen best before dates on fruits, and that's or on honey, and honey is basically non-perishable, so that's a bit concerning.
I was at the farmer's market and I bought some honey, and I did ask that question, how long does it last for? And the vendor started looking at his watch, and he said, well, in 2055 perhaps.
Exactly.
I said, I'll mark that down in my calendar. But you're right. But things like milk, for example, should we be more careful about?
We can be careful with that. If we're using for an application that requires heat, for example, making a ricotta with your leftover milk, you could use the whey to bake your focaccia, and you can use the ricotta to top off your focaccia. Professor is correct when it comes to the best before or the expiry date. There is a huge difference, and if it doesn't pass the smell test, if it's contaminated and you can see that, then throw it out, of course. But if it's smells right and you had just purchased it yesterday, but the expiry date is a bit different, go ahead and try to use that.
Okay, and temperature-wise, I think any guidelines as to leftovers, for example, how long we can keep them for?
Absolutely. So certain leftovers can be kept for about 3 days if it's refrigerated properly. And foods that have passed their best before date, bring it up to a simmer or a boil.
Okay, and rice, how long does, this is, okay, asking for a friend, how long does rice last for?
Oh, rice lasts for a long time if it's stored properly.
There you go. All right. We sometimes make a little too much. Mary writes us from Victoria. When my husband and I have leftovers that never seem enough for us to have another meal, yeah, that's a good point. We take them to a friend who is 87, and although she's busy with volunteering and golfing, she is tired of cooking. So a few times a week, we drop off dinners. She's always happy to have the meals, and she never complains about what she gets. It's always a surprise. It helps us not to waste, and she gets a delicious homemade meal. Sounds like a win-win, Mary. Thank you very much. Our last caller on this today, let's squeeze in Cosima in Kimberley. Hi, Cosima.
Hello.
Thanks for the call. What's your tip?
My biggest way of saving food waste is having a small fridge. I find most fridges are just enormous and things get lost in the chaos of the giant fridges. They've just gotten bigger and bigger. And I came upon my small fridge just by buying a house with a very old fridge in it.
Yes, yeah, the North American fridges are very large by standard. Cosima, really good point as well. Thank you so much. That's such a great little tip people can take away as well if they're looking perhaps for a way to replace their fridge or what they should keep in mind. Well, we have just a minute left, and I know that Tamara, you're part of a film. You co-wrote and co-directed a film on CBC Gem about learning from food, and we just have about a minute left. But I'll ask you both. What can we learn from various cultures about saving food and not wasting it?
When I grew up in Indonesia, I come from Indonesia, my parents always told me that don't waste a single grain of rice or else the rice will cry. And that's basically a symbolic story that rice is more than just a calorie or commodity, but it actually has cultural values, spiritual values. And so that's how I treat food, is that it's more than just food you put in, but it's the farmer's work, it's your identity.
It's our relationship with it. And what about you?
I come from a Cambodian background, so whenever a family member catches a fish or brings something home, it has a multi-purpose. Some dishes are meant for a singular focus dish, but generally in Cambodian culture, you have your starch, your sauces, your soup, your broth, your pickled vegetables, and a little bit of food can stretch a long way.
There you go. And I come from the Filipino culture, and I know you feature the Kamayan feast, all the food laid out on banana leaves, and everybody's sharing the food as well. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate having you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Fantastic conversation. Thank you to all of you for all of your calls. Tamara Somo, professor at SFU, Shanti Yen is executive chef at Nightshade Restaurant. Thanks so much for listening and watching. I'm Michelle Eliot.